It's time to tiptoe through the tulips as I am ranking all 5 Insidious movies. What's going on, guys? I'm Chris, and welcome back to another video. My ranking of all 5 Insidious movies, including The Red Door, which is the newly released film. By the way, check out my review linked up above. But I actually just watched this series for the very first time, starting last week, finishing yesterday with The Red Door. So these thoughts are very fresh. I haven't been around with this franchise a lot, so I'm a newcomer. A lot of you guys might have been with this franchise way back since the first one came out. But either way, I'm here giving my ranking of all 5 of these movies. And before I do, be sure to hit that like button. Comment down below your ranking of all 5 films, including The Red Door. And of course, subscribe and hit that notification bell to help reach my goal of 85,000 subscribers here on the channel. It would mean a lot. And check out my Patreon link down below. I've got a Discord server, extra videos, early access to videos, live Q&As, and more. Anything goes a long way, and it's been a lot of fun growing that community, so check it out down below. But let's go ahead and dive right in. All right, so coming in dead last for me is Insidious Chapter 3. This is the first time that this series kind of strayed from the norm. You know, Insidious 1 and 2 are sort of this connected story. The third movie is a straight-up prequel that still retains some of the side characters from Insidious, but unfortunately, the majority of this movie feels like a super bland, run-of-the-mill, and just generic horror movie that isn't even connected to the Insidious universe. And anytime a series does a prequel, it runs the risk of feeling really disconnected, and that is 100% the case here, as we get introduced to this new character named Quinn, and we're following this family that we'd never even seen in the franchise, so it was really hard to care, and I was even questioning, why are these people on screen? Like, I thought this was going to be more about Elise, which it sort of becomes in the third act of the film with Elise, Tucker, and Specs getting introduced to the picture. That's when the movie really felt more Insidious, but most of this was just some idiotic family with unlikable characters getting haunted by a demon. Like, it really lacked the visual aesthetic of the first 2 Insidious films directed by James Wan. And it was like that from the opening. There was no tension. Like, the opening scene of this film just felt like some random run-of-the-mill horror film, and I hate to keep using the same adjectives here, but that's exactly what Chapter 3 is. Like, the main characters that are set up in the first act and a half, damn near 2 acts of the movie are so uninteresting, and it just eventually got to the point where it felt like Elise and the other Insidious characters were just guest starring in this, like, prolonged horror episode of TV. It didn't really feel like a full movie that was warranted, and it got fairly ridiculous in the third act, coming across as just straight up nonsense. So while there are some solid scares, hell, it's an Insidious movie. All 5 of these have some solid scares for sure. I can't help but feel like this movie didn't need to exist and is a huge step down in quality from the past 2 films, though I will admit Specs, played by Lee Winnell, carries the little amount of screen time that he does have. He is the bright light in an otherwise meh to fairly bad movie. It should have just been Elise, and they do that later in another prequel we'll talk about in a second. But my number 4 on this list is the newly released Insidious: The Red Door. This is a movie that features the directorial debut of Patrick Wilson, who plays Josh in the first 2 films and obviously comes back in this film to play the head of the Lambert family. Now, this is a movie that frustrates me because there's so much potential. I thought it had a fantastic opening scene that built tension really, really well, especially as we headed into like the opening credit sequence. I was like, okay, we're in for a treat here. And I was fascinated with this concept of Josh and Dalton sort of encountering things from their past. They're trying to jog their memory of this whole year of their lives that's totally forgotten. Obviously, the events of the first 2 Insidious films. So I thought there was a lot to work with. The premise was set up, but the movie unfortunately became more of this coming-of-age teen drama where Dalton's going off to college and trying to figure out his true purpose in life. And then you've got this family drama going on with the Lamberts, and Josh is trying to discover more about his past. So it became this tonally clashing mess to me where one scene we'd be at this college party, and then the next scene, Josh would be looking through photos, but then he'd be haunted by a demon. So it had Insidious elements, and I really have to tip my hat to Patrick Wilson because he had moments to shine here in the director's chair. Some shots James Wan would be proud of. Like, I really believe he has that director's eye, and there are glimpses of that here, but it's held back by a script that's pretty lackluster, and it doesn't really have that Insidious feel. Again, there are moments where I'm like, oh, this is like that classic Insidious vibe from the first 2 movies, but a lot of the times it relies on the CGI special effects, which is sort of abandoning what made the first 2 films great, with the James Wan practical effects and jump scares that have a lot of build-up that pay off. Of course, there are a few jump scares here that really got me and I thought were effective, but near the end of the movie, it got to the point point where it was almost jump scare overload, and for what reason. They weren't really effective. It was just like, oh, here's a jump scare, and the third act of this movie really gets a little nonsensical. To me, it's not really explained as to how certain characters are able to do certain things or appear in certain places within the franchise. It got really muddled toward the end for me, leading to a somewhat rushed finale. And while there are glimpses of that classic Insidious feel here, I can't help but feel like this is a fairly tame entry in the franchise. Honestly, there are large windows of the movie where there's not really any tension, and I was like, this is a horror movie, right? What I love about the first two Insidious films is that they have me on edge from beginning to end. This one sort of failed to do that. There are moments of brilliance, like the MRI scene, great. And then the opening I thought was fantastic, but these little pockets of brilliance are overall overshadowed by a movie that doesn't really feel wholly necessary. A lot of this film genuinely is rehashing prior conflict we as the audience have already seen, and the characters are just re-experiencing stuff that we've already seen and knowledge we already understand, so it was sort of hard to really be invested. And then by the time we actually get to the final 25 minutes, it's almost too little too late. So again, Insidious the Red Door frustrates me because there's a lot of potential here, but overall it falls short in the grand scheme of this franchise, unfortunately. But moving on, my number 3 might surprise some of you, and again, I just watched these movies last week, so I have no attachment to the franchise. Insidious The Last Key. The movie's not great, don't get me wrong, but I think it's a better prequel than 3, and overall, a better Insidious movie than The Red Door. This movie completely focuses on Elise, and she actually goes back to her childhood home when she gets a call that it's being haunted. And that right there is a fascinating setup, because Elise is one of the stronger characters in this franchise, and Chapter 3 failed to fully dive into her backstory. This is the prequel I would have wanted from the first Insidious film. So I almost just scratched 3 from my memory, and if I'm like, oh, I want an Insidious prequel, I'm going with The Last Key because it's a fascinating concept. Elise goes back to her home, it's being haunted, and she has to relive certain demons from her past while also uncovering the sort of murder mystery along the way. There's a lot of reveals here that had me shook. It was a very clever script in my opinion. Now sure, it's not as strong of a movie as the first two, but at least it knows what it is and it solely focuses on Elise as opposed to introducing some annoying new family like in the third film to be the main characters. Again, this movie sort of falls victim to these cheap jump scares, but there's one that got me damn good. I don't know if it was because oh, the movie's about to end and then it just really got me. Sure, I probably should have seen it coming, but for whatever reason, it had me damn near jump out of my chair and I was watching it at home. So shout out to that jump scare and that damn demon. If you know, you know. But this movie is definitely a huge drop off in quality compared to the first two, but still retains that Insidious feel. There's some terrifying moments, especially in the third act, and I love exploring the further. That's what the third act really brought me. That's one of my favorite elements of the Insidious franchise is when we delve more into the further, and I thought it really delivered on that in the end of the film. Now, I will say there were some cool tie-ins to the first Insidious film. Some might say, oh, why are we doing this? But to me, it worked, and yeah, it might be a little fan servicey, but I thought it was fitting to tie it in directly to the first Insidious movie. It's always cool to see a prequel do that, and I thought that it worked perfectly. Like, it flows seamlessly from the end of The Last Key right into the beginning of the first Insidious. So in terms of a prequel, it gave me everything I wanted. We got to fully understand Elise and learn more about her backstory, her traumatizing past growing up. We got more Tucker and Specs, which I'm never going to complain about. They're some of the franchise best characters in my opinion. And overall, we got a movie that has some solid enough scares, though it does feel more like a straight to streaming flick instead of like a Insidious movie at times, directorially speaking in particular. I still enjoy my time with this movie. Not sure if I'll ever rewatch it, but it's got some scares for sure. My runner-up is Insidious Chapter 2. James Wan knows what he's doing with these first two movies, and this is a damn good sequel. It's a little campier at times, but I appreciate that. Patrick Wilson's very creepy in this movie, and I love how it sort of embraces these slasher elements in the third act. Getting a little cheesy, but it is self-aware of what it is and still is filled with fright, in my opinion. I thought the movie had some brilliant reveals along the way that almost pulled my heartstrings in a way, but it was a really smart movie, and there were some terrifying, like, bone-chilling sequences, specifically when they go to, like, that hospital, and we learn the backstory on, like, the bride ghost. Oh my gosh, there were so many reveals that kept me guessing left and right, like, jaw-dropping moment after jaw-dropping moment. This is a clever movie. It's got James Wan written all over it, and it is a very worthy follow-up to the first Insidious. Like, it's not quite as scary as the first movie, but there's still tension from beginning to end. Like I said, that hospital scene is terrifying stuff when we get that flashback, and there's a certain shot in an elevator where we see a certain someone standing next to Josh's mother, and we don't even see like his eyes, we just see part of his face. That shot is haunting to me. And again, leave it to James Wan to have me completely shook with all of his clever twists and turns along the way. This is a very worthy follow-up to the first Insidious and makes for one hell of a double feature. Insidious Chapter 2 is an entertaining movie that, again, delivered everything I wanted. It was scary, had me tense, but also had that classic like Insidious humor at times where I was like, okay, this is a nice little breath of fresh air, a little comedic relief. So overall, Insidious Chapter 2 is a damn good follow-up, and in my opinion, I can even view this as the end of the franchise and be completely satisfied. But coming in at number 1 is the first Insidious. I had built this movie up to be the most terrifying thing ever growing up. I didn't watch it for the first time until last week, but I finally overcame my fears because growing up, my friends were always like, oh, this movie's the most terrifying thing ever. And I had even seen certain scenes from the movie, and so I had built it up to be just traumatizingly scary. And I finally overcame my demons and watched this movie. And overall, I can say this delivered. It's very spooky and intense because James Wan comes in and directs the hell out of this movie. Like, this is almost more thrilling than anything else. I was so invested from the opening with just the lack of score and soundtrack. There was this eerie feel from the start, and it just kept building and building. Like, there would be a scene where I'm like, oh my god, I'm clenching because I know there's about to be a jump scare, and then it would just release, there would be nothing. So that, to me, shows how brilliant of a director James Wan is, where he would have so many fake outs where it keeps you uneasy for the majority of this runtime. On top of that, we get introduced to this family and we see sort of their dynamics before anything goes down. Like, there's a while in this movie where this family just living their normal life, but something is clearly off with the house. And I think that is sort of evidenced through the color grading and lighting of this film, where it's got this very gray, pale tone to it that, again, makes it feel very hellish almost. Like, there's this ominous tone that is established from the opening credits of this film, and my god, does this movie deliver on some jump scares. Now, I had seen one of the worst ones before going into this movie, but it's filled with some terrifying moments, some of the scariest I've ever seen in horror films. Like, this movie's genuinely unsettling at times, and certain plot reveals got me really, really good. It's one of the cleverest horror films I've seen. James Wan truly is a master horror director, and the somewhat cliffhanger ending I thought was perfect. There are reveals in this film that genuinely shook me to my core, and all around, I really dug Insidious. It's one of those movies that ever since I first watched it, it's grown on me the more and more I think about it and discuss the film. It leaves a lot to the imagination, which is the most effective type of horror. Like, in Jaws, if they showed the shark at the very beginning of the movie, kind of would have taken you out of the movie a little bit, because you're like, oh, that's what is after them. But if you build up this fear of what are these demons, what is actually haunting this family, your imagination can run wild and make it scarier than the movie actually is, and James Wan is aware of that, and that fully shines through in the first Insidious movie. I can safely say that Insidious, hell, even Chapter 2, were some of my new favorite horror films, and ones that I'll be throwing into the rewatch rotation very, very soon. But overall, Insidious is a solid horror franchise. You got 2 really good entries, 3 is pretty bad, 4 is decent enough, and even The Red Door, while a little lackluster, still has entertainment value. So if you average all that out, it makes for a very solid horror franchise, and one of the better ones that I've actually seen in its entirety. But what do you guys think of Insidious, The Red Door? What is your ranking of these movies? Let me know in the comments down below, and be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to help me reach my goal of 85,000 subscribers here on the channel. It would mean a lot. And of course, check out my Patreon link down below. I actually just revamped it, so if you want access to early videos, extra exclusive videos, live Q&As in the Discord server, that is all linked down below. But thank you guys so much for watching. Stay tuned for more content coming very soon, and until next time, I'll see you guys later.